We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Ian Slattery. Ian Slattery is the associate producer for the new documentary film Soldiers of Conscience, which is playing in Seattle next week, starting November 2nd through the 8th at SIF Theater at McCaw Hall. If you would begin, tell us what was the motivation in producing the film Soldiers of Conscience?
Well, it originally started when our director and one of our executive producers met and started talking about what was going on with conscientious objectors in the current war. One of our executive producers, Stan Friedman, began his career as a lawyer defending conscientious objectors in the Vietnam era. And he was very interested to know what is happening with those guys today in the context of an all-volunteer army. What's happening with their stories. And our director, Gary Weinberg, was very, very intrigued by that. And they found, right about then, they found out about the story of Kevin Benderman, who was facing court-martial in Georgia for basically missing a movement to return to Iraq with his unit. And so that was a very quick turnaround, and they flew out there and started filming with Kevin and Monica, and that was really how it got started.
Okay, maybe you can give us a little history on the conscientious objectors. I know that in your film you point out that in previous wars, it turns out there was a very high number of people that chose, when the situation finally came up, to shoot someone, they would choose not to fire their weapon.
Well, that's a very important fact in the film, and it's something that people are often very surprised by. And the statistic was actually researched by an Army historian, a guy by the name of S.L.A. Marshall, who was a brigadier general in World War II, and his job was to go and study what was happening during the war. And his research showed that 3 out of 4 soldiers in combat, so these are soldiers who are in combat, facing live fire, did not fire at the enemy, did not fire their weapons. So the idea being, and he writes this in his book, he says, at the vital point, looking down the barrel, they became conscientious objectors. In that sense that there was a natural aversion to killing a fellow human being, regardless of the circumstances. Even in a situation where they knew that their lives were on the line, they still found it in themselves to, I'm not going to be able to do this. And an interesting point on that is, that's a statistic that's in the film, and people are often very intrigued by it, but they don't necessarily have a personal story to fit that statistic into. And we were doing a preview screening of the film in Berkeley, California at a senior center, and there was a World War II veteran there who stood up at the end of the film and said that he had been a heavy machine gunner in World War II, and he thought he was the only heavy machine gunner who had never fired. And he was crying and saying that he couldn't believe that there were others out there, and that in fact it was a very, very common thing, but he had kept that inside for, he said we were the first people he had ever told. So
what did the Army and the military do to respond to the finding out those numbers existed?
Well, and this is something that's covered in the film, they needed to identify ways of getting soldiers to overcome this kind of natural aversion to killing. And so they developed a training procedure known as Reflexive Fire, as well as other training procedures designed to get soldiers to act on instinct, to act on reflex, rather than thinking through what they're necessarily doing. So there's footage in the film, and you see soldiers at basic training being urged to shoot right away as soon as a target comes up, for example, with the idea being that that's going to save their life, it's going to save the life of their fellow soldiers. And so from the military's point of view, that's a necessary thing they need to do. And it's helped increase firing rates. So now, when they look at how many soldiers are firing in combat, according to the military, it's close to 100%. Almost all soldiers are firing in combat. They've been trained to do that. But the other kind of darker side of this is that, and this is something that's been the focus of one of the soldiers profiled in the film, a West Point professor. One of the darker sides of this is that soldiers are acting without necessarily processing the moral ramifications of their actions. They're not necessarily thinking through, okay, I'm going to go and I'm gonna kill that person who I'm seeing right there. I know that's gonna happen. They're just acting without thinking, and that he contends, Major Kilner, that this has very, very serious consequences for our soldiers, particular after the fact, particularly when they come home. And he cites research that indicates that this may be linked to some of the increased evidence of PTSD and other kind of traumatic experiences for soldiers.
So talk about the process you went through in deciding who to include in this film. You basically focus on about 8 primary people, is that right?
That's right. Well, as I mentioned, it started out focusing on Kevin Benderman because his case was so salient at the moment, and through Kevin, our filmmakers met Camilo Mejia and Aidan Delgado and Joshua Castile, who are 3 of the other conscientious objectors who are shown in the film, and so filmed with them. And as we moved forward with the film, we were especially our directors were realizing that we could do a film that just focused on them, but that wasn't necessarily the whole piece of the story. That wasn't multiple viewpoints. It was their viewpoints, and we find them to be incredibly inspiring individuals. But we also know that there's individuals who are going to come and watch the film who are going to have questions about that and maybe see things a different way. And we wanted this film to be able to reach broad audiences and generate discussion among people who maybe disagree. We felt that was very important, and so we started a process of going to the military to get permission to film with Major Kilner, whose research we had studied and read about, and he was receptive to being filmed. And so that was the process of getting the military to say, okay, this is okay. You can film with Major Kilner, and you can also film with drill sergeants and active duty soldiers on base locations.
Yeah, I found that very refreshing. To all the people that you have portrayed in the film are all very thoughtful, and whether you agree with them or not, I mean, you can clearly see that these are people that have thought this issue and these issues through and are telling you exactly what they honestly think and feel. So
yeah, one of the messages that we've tried to put forward with the film is that all soldiers are soldiers of conscience. Every soldier has a conscience. Every soldier is wrestling with these issues. It doesn't mean they're all going to come to the same conclusion. And the conscientious objectors are certainly the first to realize that because their stand is often a solitary one. So that's really something that we were finding.
I assume you did interviews with people that weren't in the film. What was kind of the threshold for whether people made it or not?
Well, that's a good question. When our first cut of the film was about 2.5 hours long, and I think that would have been way too long I know it would have been way too long for me. So time is often the biggest consideration in how you can tell a story. The other thing is we were finding that really the stories of these 4 soldiers who had gone and seen combat, had been deployed and had then chosen to leave the military. That was what we wanted to build it around, as well as the idea of how the military trains soldiers to overcome some of that natural aversion to killing. So some of the soldiers who we filmed with who were not included are some Vietnam veterans who we filmed with, whose stories are incredibly valuable to hear. But in the end, we weren't able to include them because it didn't necessarily fit into the overall story of what this film is. And hopefully it's been addressed somewhat with other films, such as a recent film, Sir No Sir, and other films that address in some ways that aspect of the Vietnam era. And then we also filmed with Amy Allison and Catherine Jashinsky, who are 2 conscientious objectors, the former from the Desert Storm, the first Iraq conflict, and the latter from the current conflict, and specifically Afghanistan. And again, for reasons of time and the overall story, we weren't able to include them, but we hope to use some of that footage and their stories in a future shorter project.
Talk a little bit about one of the things that this film helps us understand and is one of the cruxes of the problem is the idea that many soldiers, when they come back, they can't really talk about these issues. They can talk about the war amongst other soldiers, but they have an aversion to talking to civilians, the rest of the people that have never participated in this, because of the idea that no one else but a soldier can understand.
Yeah, that was a very common theme that we had from in speaking with soldiers in making this film. It's also a common theme that I've experienced in my life speaking with my grandparents, for example, who were World War II veterans. You're absolutely right that soldiers often said to us, look, I can tell you about this. I can talk to you. I have stories. You're not going to understand. You're never going to understand. You've never been there. And you're absolutely right that it's something that soldiers sometimes can talk with each other about, but that really our hope is that this film is able to be a place where the audience can come and listen to soldiers who chose to remain in the military and soldiers who decided that they needed to leave because of reasons of conscience, all talking about some of those issues that they rarely talk about. And one of the reasons that they don't, according to soldiers and according to Pete Kilner in the film, are that they often worry the kind of reaction that they're going to get. So one of the drill sergeants in the film mentions how his relatives, one of the first questions he gets, and one of the first questions that many soldiers get when they come back from combat is, "Did you kill anyone?" And the response to that often leads to people being kind of weirded out or offended or scared or whatever it is, because people sense it's a taboo subject. So if a soldier says, "Yes, I did kill someone over there," people will, as the soldier in the film mentions, people will change the subject. They don't want to really talk about it. So on our end, we also don't necessarily want to talk about it, and we're kind of averse to hearing about it from the soldiers themselves. So again, we hope that the film can be a point where the audience can come and listen to soldiers actually giving voice to some of those concerns that they've had.
Which is somewhat ironic that the people ask the question, and this isn't true of all situations, but in that particular instance, that the people ask the question and then he responds positively, a chance there to open up and have this conversation that is desperately needed by our populace, and then they shut it down by then either having said it too lightly and not intending to follow through.
And I think I just want to mention, I think that speaks to something about the disconnection between our concept of what war is and what soldiers actually experience, because our country chooses situations in which to send military force to go and essentially ask soldiers, our fellow citizens, to kill people. But when they come back, we have a disconnect with what they've actually done. And when we address it, when it comes up, it's difficult for people to realize. And that's something that's in the film. It's difficult for people to understand this action that this person that I'm speaking with represents me. It's something they've just done on behalf of me. Whether I was supportive of the war from the beginning or not supportive of the war, they've done something and made done something that possibly they supremely regret on behalf of me. And that I can certainly see how that could make someone very uncomfortable to talk about, or it could be very jarring for their own kind of reality.
And yet it seems like something that is both critical to the individual that participated in the war as a soldier, as well as the society that sent them there, that they should have to engage in this and find out what happened.
And one of the themes that's come up in recent kind of preview screenings that we've done about the film, and I know it was part of the motivation of our executive producers, was the idea of when is an appropriate time to ask soldiers to make that sacrifice. When is a situation? What is the threshold for asking soldiers to do something that, by all accounts, we know is going to be awful for the intended targets of violence as well as the perpetrators of violence?
So did you get a sense for what the conditions are that we as a society need to create to allow soldiers to be able to share their stories about what happened? I mean, is it these one-on-ones, for instance, like in the film that you've created?
Well, that's a good question. I think our film is one way of starting to address those, and conversations that come out of the film is one way to do that. I think what we hope happens with the film is that there's a broader sense that questions of conscience are legitimate. They're legitimate discussions. They're a legitimate topic for discussion among soldiers and civilians, and that we can talk about it without it being a taboo, that we can talk about it and foster that atmosphere where soldiers who may before have thought, I'm not going to mention that, I don't want to mention that to anyone, and I'm not going to say it to my fellow soldiers that I had concerns or whatever it is, will feel more comfortable being able to talk about it, knowing that they're not going to be castigated or made fun of for it, but in fact, maybe other soldiers might be sharing those concerns, maybe other civilians are sharing those concerns and aren't going to judge them for it. So that's one thing. I think obviously also other organizations, veterans organizations, support organizations, organizations working with families are all also doing that work in concrete ways, and they're doing it right now. We're just getting started with our film, but I think those are other opportunities where soldiers share with soldiers. For instance, there's an organization called Vets for Vets that does that. Other organizations that are based around a concept of conscience, like Iraq Veterans Against the War, is a situation where there are veterans who have come around the idea that that this was wrong, war is wrong, and so I think there's lots of venues for soldiers to start to address some of those concerns, and I hope our film can be a piece of that.
And there are numerous examples, I can't remember if it was specific to your film, of soldiers that definitely agreed with the war and the concept that are just as haunted by what happened as soldiers that disagreed with the war.
That's right. Some of the soldiers portrayed in the film are very much fit that description, and it fits into what we were saying before about them experiencing war and you not being able to understand it unless you've been there. A lot of the soldiers, they're haunted by that, or it's something that's still on their mind. But within themselves, they've found a way to justify continuing to be in the military. And our hope is that you can have someone who agrees with those folks and someone who agrees maybe more with the conscientious objectors in the film talk about the issues raised by the film, talk about the fact that both are sharing that concern, both are sharing that sense of being kind of haunted by some of what they did with each other, and that we as a nation can address some of what they share.
It was interesting watching the film. You got the sense that even though the military is designed not to support or promote people that are conscientious objectors, that you still heard from people's testimony that there was this infrastructure and or support networks within the military that supported these people throughout, although that there was certainly infrastructure and protocols to hinder that.
Yeah, I think the key words there is there are guidelines, there are protocols for how to follow it, but I wouldn't say that there's a support network. I think that the soldiers in the film experienced, the ones that applied for conscientious objector status, experienced a very, very lonely road and a situation of trying to uncover what are the procedures for applying for conscientious objection, because I don't think it's very well known within the military, even though it is on the books. So I think that was makes it such an interesting story to go see, that it wasn't something that they were just able to check off on a box. That it was something they had to apply for, be interviewed for, and face the kind of response of their fellow soldiers who they were serving with. They had to face all of those things in order to pursue conscientious objection status. But I should also mention, and this is in the film, that conscientious objection status and that idea of refusing to participate in war because of your beliefs in the United States goes back to the Continental Congress. It's seen in every war that has happened, that the United States has participated in. There's been some form of recognition of that. Now, it wasn't always followed the same way, and soldiers were certainly not always treated with respect or admiration for their choice to become conscientious objectors. But it is something that's been around for a long time, and is still a part of current military guidelines. So it's still very much an option.
I guess I should have clarified myself better that the infrastructure within there, I saw the examples I saw were more from soldiers, individual soldiers, as opposed to the U.S. Army itself. So give us an overview of, has the number of conscientious objectors increased, decreased as time has gone on? Have you seen any impact from it being, quote unquote, an all-volunteer army now?
I think a lot of folks who were I was not alive during the Vietnam era, but I think a lot of folks who were and that I've spoken with would attest to the fact that there were far greater numbers of conscientious objectors in that context, in particular because it was a draft. There was soldiers being called in, and they had to make the choice. Currently, in our current context of a volunteer army, a very, very small percentage of the population does the fighting on our behalf. And so as a result, individuals don't have to make that choice. Only soldiers who have signed up to go and join the military are faced eventually with the decision of can I fight in combat, can I do this, can I kill? So I think that's been a big transition. And I think there was also a greater national feeling especially during the later parts of the Vietnam era, that questioning with your conscience what was going on was a legitimate that was something people could talk about, and that was something that a large part of the country started to get behind. And I think that's in some ways that's happening again around the Iraq War. But the military themselves, the soldiers themselves, I think there's far fewer now, kind of as a result of that. Now, but part of what our film's trying to get at is that doesn't mean that soldiers are necessarily not having qualms, or that soldiers are not dealing with severe, serious questions about what they're being asked to do, or when they're being, the overall purpose of what they're being asked to do in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other potential future conflicts. So.
You had the cooperation of the U.S. Army in producing this film. What has been their reaction now that it is out? And also, you've been showing it at different film festivals, as well as some engagements here in Seattle. What has been the audience reaction and/or questions?
Well, those are great questions. The first piece about the military, as you mentioned, we made the film with the official permission from the U.S. Army, and what that means is that you've contacted their Office of Public Affairs, and you've described what you're doing with the film, and they've agreed to let you speak with soldiers and have access to that kind of speaking with soldiers and being on base, and that was a long process of trying to explain to them what we were doing and let them know where our intentions were. And in the end, they approved that, and they let us speak with soldiers. And the requirement in the end was that we send them a copy of the DVD, and they got to just check it for accuracy errors or issues relating to national security. If there was someone was being was going to be in danger because of something that we were doing in the film, there was one tiny change where they asked us to blur the face of one of the Iraqi translators who was working with U.S. forces. And we were very glad to do that. And but other than that, they signed off on the film at the end, and they described it as a thought-provoking film. So that's been their response, and now we're the film's done and we're moving forward. So that's been our experience with that. As far as festivals, we've been screening in festivals across the country since April was our first festival premiere. And have gotten really strong responses from a variety of places, both from audiences and from judges and juries of festivals. We won the Best Documentary at the Rhode Island International Film Festival, and just recently, I guess it was last weekend, won the Conflict and Resolution Award at the Hamptons International Film Festival. So it's been getting that kind of response. And something that also has been happening at film festivals is there have been several stories where our directors have been there, and veterans have come up to them after the film has ended and had extremely emotional responses to it. So, for instance, at the Hamptons Film Festival just last weekend, a female veteran came up to our director, Gary Weinberg, after the film, and said that there had been something inside her that was dead that was now being kind of reborn as a result of seeing the film. It was hard for her to watch the film, and some veterans have expressed that it's been very hard to watch the film, but she felt it was very, very worthwhile to see it, and said that this has got to get out there. This is what a lot of soldiers were experiencing. This is not it kind of continues to let us know that we are on the right track here. This is something that is deeper and is out there. So those experiences have been really powerful, and that's been happening at film festivals, not necessarily the place that you would automatically expect veterans and soldiers to be at, going and seeing a film. So that lets us know we're on the right track. And then the last piece that you mentioned is we've been in Seattle this weekend, basically starting Thursday, with over 25 screenings, preview screenings of the film that have been taking place in places of worship across Seattle and the Puget Sound, starting in Tacoma on Thursday and just last night here in Ballard and the University District. And these screenings have been put together with an incredible effort of collaboration with a variety of groups in the Seattle area, including the Church Council of Greater Seattle, the Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center, Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Lutheran Peace Fellowship. These are all leaders in the faith community in Seattle who have come together to say, this is a film that needs to be in our communities, in our congregations. This needs to be a subject for conversation. It's something that we know already kind of fits into spiritual and religious inquiry. And we know that from their reaction that they feel the same, and that it's something that they really think can be a useful resource, a useful discussion starter for that venue for a religious community.
All right, and then the film itself, does it have a website too?
It does. It's the film website is www.socfilm.com. So that's SOC as in Soldiers of Conscience, socfilm.com.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in this morning.
Thank you.
We've just been talking with Ian Slattery. He is the associate producer of the new documentary film, Soldiers of Conscience. And again, you can find out more about the film at the website socfilm.com.